Two nations, one border, a history soaked in rivalry. For decades, India and Pakistan stood on the edge of conflict, sometimes shouting, sometimes whispering, but never silent. Their story was written in ink, blood, and silence across the fields of Punjab, the peaks of Kashmir, and the hearts of millions. But in 2025, something changed. It started with a single shot, a convoy ambushed, a flag burned. Then came the air raids, the blackouts, the fire raining from the sky, and the world watched, paralyzed, as old wounds tore open and history repeated itself, louder and deadlier. This is the story of how the India-Pakistan War of 2025 began. Not with a declaration, but with a funeral. Chapter 1. A funeral in April. It was a quiet morning in Delhi. The sun was out, but not too bright. A soft wind moved the branches of the trees. Birds chirped, unaware of the silence among the people gathered in the graveyard. A small crowd stood around a fresh grave. Men in uniform, a few women in white saris. No one spoke much, no one smiled. The coffin had already been lowered. Flowers had been placed gently on top. A priest stood by, reading the final words. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. His voice was calm, his tone was steady, but the pain in the air was heavy. At the front of the group stood an old man. His back was straight, his eyes were hard. He wore a black suit, but his military medals still shined on his chest. His name was Colonel Pratap Singh. He had served the army for over 30 years. Now he had come to bury a young soldier, his nephew. His name was Arjun, only 23 years old. Pratap didn't cry. He didn't speak at first, but everyone looked at him, waiting. Finally, he stepped forward. He looked down at the grave. "This is not just a death," he said. "This is a message." People shifted uncomfortably. Some looked down. A woman behind him let out a soft sob. The colonel continued. Arjun was part of something bigger. He was part of a mission that failed, a mission we were never supposed to talk about. People listened more closely now. They had heard whispers, but no one knew for sure. The government had said nothing. The news channels were quiet, but the silence had begun to feel strange. Now, standing at the grave, the truth began to leak out. Colonel Pratap looked around at the crowd. "We sent a team across the border, into Pakistan, a quiet operation, not to attack, just to observe. We had reason to believe something dangerous was being planned. But we were wrong. They knew we were coming. It was a trap." He stopped and took a deep breath. None of them came back, except Arjun, and even he only survived long enough to tell us what happened, what he saw. It changed everything. A man in the back of the crowd whispered, "So it's true?" The colonel nodded slowly. "It's true. This is the beginning." The mourners were quiet again. Only the sound of wind and rustling leaves filled the space. The colonel stepped back. He gave a final salute. The priest ended the service with a soft Amen. One by one, the people left. But their minds were full of fear, full of questions. Outside the graveyard, the streets of Delhi bustled with life. People bought vegetables, kids played cricket. But none of them knew that just days ago, the border had erupted. It wasn't on the news yet, not fully. But something was happening. Something big. 2 nights ago, an Indian Air Force base in Jammu had been struck by missiles. Official reports blamed a technical failure, but people close to the army knew better. Troops had been moved quietly. Reserve units had been activated. Northern Command was on high alert. Helicopters flew over the border towns every hour. People in Punjab and Rajasthan could feel it. Something was off. The funeral was just the first sign. 1 life lost. But many more would follow. Colonel Pratap returned to his car. He sat inside for a while before turning the key. On the dashboard lay a small notebook. It was Arjun's journal, the last thing he had carried. The pages were damaged, burnt at the edges, but the words were still clear. On one of the pages, Arjun had written, "We crossed the border at night. We moved like shadows. But they were waiting. Not just soldiers, something else. It felt organized, like they wanted us to see what they were preparing. It wasn't just defense, it was a plan to strike first, and hard." Pratap closed the book. His face was pale. The war had not been declared yet, but it had already begun. That evening, as Delhi lit up with city lights and traffic horns filled the streets, somewhere in the mountains of Kashmir, 2 armies faced each other through binoculars and night vision scopes. The peace was over. The countdown had begun. And so, the story starts, not with loud bombs or speeches, but with a funeral, a young soldier buried, a secret revealed, a storm about to break. Chapter 2. Border Sparks. High in the Himalayas, where the wind cuts like a knife and the silence is broken only by boots and snow, a single shot rang out. It was early April. Near the town of Kupwara, in the rugged terrain of Kashmir, Indian border patrols had spotted unusual movement, figures slipping through the shadows just across the line of control. What started as a routine watch post alert turned into a sudden firefight. For nearly an hour, bullets echoed off the cliffs, bouncing through the mountain air like thunder. When the shooting stopped, 3 Indian soldiers were dead. 2 Pakistani troops were also reported killed. The snow turned red. And just like that, the spark had been lit. In Delhi, army commanders called it a planned infiltration. In Islamabad, officials claimed it was a misunderstanding provoked by Indian aggression. But on the ground, the truth was simpler. Lives had been lost, and the old scars of Kashmir had been torn open once more. The next day, Indian forces launched a search operation in the dense pine forests along the border. Helicopters hovered overhead. Pakistani units responded by reinforcing their forward posts. Tensions, as they had so many times before, began to rise. But this time, something was different. This time, there was no back-channel diplomacy, no quiet calls between military leaders, no press conference to cool things down. Instead, there were missiles, test launches on both sides, shown on national TV, complete with dramatic music and fiery trails. The message was loud: "We're ready." News anchors turned into generals overnight. Phrases like retaliatory options and surgical precision echoed in studios. Maps of the border lit up with graphics and speculation. Every flash of light in the night sky was treated as a possible strike, and through all the noise, fear crept in. In cities like Chandigarh and Rawalpindi, sirens began to wail. Civil defense drills, long forgotten, were practiced again. Families cleared out basements. Children were told to pack emergency bags. Hospitals checked their disaster response plans. Supermarkets emptied. In schools, students whispered about war. On WhatsApp, forwarded messages about upcoming attacks spread like wildfire. Some of it was fake. Some of it was terrifyingly real, and no one could tell the difference. Yet, through it all, many people still believed it would pass. They'd seen it before: skirmishes, threats, angry speeches. This wasn't the first time tensions had flared along the border. "They'll cool off," some said. "It's just politics," others believed, but they were wrong. On the third day after the Kupwara clash, an Indian convoy was ambushed while moving through a narrow mountain road near Uri. Explosives buried under the road detonated with precision. Gunmen fired from the trees. 41 Indian paramilitary personnel died on the spot. The nation gasped. Within hours, news channels replayed the burning wreckage on loop. Anger spilled into the streets. Hashtags trended: #, never forget, #, time to strike, #, blood for blood. Candlelight vigils turned into rallies. Calls for action rang louder than calls for peace. The Indian Prime Minister, Anaya Deshmukh, stood before the press. This was not an accident. This was an act of terror, and those who carried it out, and those who shelter them, will be held accountable. Across the border, the Pakistani government denied involvement, but hardened their stance. Prime Minister Tariq Jamil responded, "Pakistan is being blamed without evidence. If India chooses aggression, we will answer in kind." The skies above Kashmir, once calm, now buzzed with drones and jets. Troops along the border were put on high alert. Military vehicles rolled into towns. Fighter planes practiced takeoff drills every few hours. The war drums had begun. In the villages along the line of control, old men dug out rusted shovels. Bunkers built in 1999 were cleared of dust. Young children were taught how to lie flat when the shelling started. In some places, school bells were replaced by air raid sirens. And in the capital cities, Delhi and Islamabad, the mood was grim. Both leaders refused to blink. Both populations held their breath. And in the cold mountains where it had all begun, the soldiers waited, eyes on the horizon, fingers on triggers, hearts pounding with the knowledge that the next shot could be the one to shatter everything. The spark had caught. The fire was spreading. The countdown had begun. Chapter 3. The First Strike. It happened just before dawn. The sky over the line of control was still dark. Cold winds swept through the valleys. The soldiers on both sides were alert, fingers tight on their rifles, eyes fixed on the silence. They knew something was coming. They just didn't know when. At exactly 4:17 a.m., the first sound broke through the quiet. A roar. It was the sound of jet engines. Fast. Low. Angry. Indian Air Force fighters crossed into Pakistani airspace. Precision strike aircraft, Mirage 2000s, loaded with smart bombs. Their target, a suspected terror training camp deep inside Pakistani territory near Bahawalpur. Intelligence had confirmed that the attackers of the Indian convoy days earlier had launched from this camp. The convoy attack had shaken the nation. 41 paramilitary officers traveling through Jammu in the early morning hours had been ambushed. A blast tore through the lead vehicle. Gunmen followed. It was a message, loud and clear. The Indian government responded with speed. Enough waiting. Enough warnings. The green light was given. Strike first. Strike hard. The jets moved in silence. Radar evading, guided by satellites, their path calculated down to the second. The bombs hit their targets with terrifying precision. 1, 2, 3 explosions. The ground shook. Fire lit up the sky. Surveillance drones captured everything. Within minutes, the jets were heading back across the border. India called it a non-military preemptive strike. Pakistan called it an act of war. Within an hour, sirens wailed across Lahore. The Pakistani Air Force scrambled its jets. Anti-aircraft units took positions. Cities near the border were put on emergency alert. The response was immediate and fierce. By 9 a.m., Pakistani artillery opened fire along the border. Shells rained down on Indian army posts in Poonch and Rajouri. Several soldiers were killed. The border villages were evacuated. Civilians ran with only what they could carry. Schools were shut. Roads were blocked. The air felt thick with fear. By noon, the skies were alive. Fighter jets from both countries danced dangerously close, locking radars, dodging missiles. One Indian Sukhoi was hit near Sialkot. The pilot ejected and was captured. By evening, a Pakistani F-16 went down near Pathankot. The war had moved into the open. Back in Delhi and Islamabad, news anchors shouted over each other. Maps lit up with red zones. Rumors spread faster than facts. Social media overflowed with images, some real, many fake. But one thing was certain now. This was no longer a standoff. It was war. In Lahore, loudspeakers urged people to take shelter. Families packed into basements. Hospitals prepared for casualties. In Amritsar, the Golden Temple stood calm as people prayed, even as army trucks rolled past. The first 3 days were chaos. Skirmishes broke out in Siachen, Kargil, and the Thar Desert. Drones flew non-stop. Borders turned into battlegrounds, and with each hour, the cost grew heavier. By the end of the first week, more than 300 lives were lost. Soldiers, civilians, even children caught in the crossfire. World leaders called for calm. The United Nations held emergency meetings, but the fire had already spread. Neither side was ready to back down. Too many wounds, too much history, too many headlines that demanded revenge. And so, The war that had started with shadows and secrets now filled the sky with smoke and the earth with fire. Back in Delhi, Prime Minister Anaya Deshmukh addressed the nation. "We did not start this war, but we will finish it. For every soldier lost, for every innocent killed, we will stand firm. We want peace, but we will not kneel for it." In Islamabad, Prime Minister Tariq Jamil replied, "Pakistan will not be bullied. Our soil was attacked, our people threatened. We will defend ourselves with every force we have. 2 nations, 1 border, and now a battlefield." The war had begun, not with words, not with politics, but with bombs in the dark sky and smoke that refused to clear. Chapter 4: Global Reactions. The world woke up to chaos. Across every continent, headlines screamed the same message. India and Pakistan exchange strikes. War has begun. In New York, emergency meetings were called at the United Nations headquarters. Diplomats scrambled into rooms, their faces tight with anxiety. Behind closed doors, nations debated language. Should they call it a conflict, a war, or an emergency? While they argued over words, people on the ground were losing lives. By noon, the UN issued a statement. "We urge both parties to exercise maximum restraint. Dialogue is essential. Civilians must be protected." But the words felt hollow. The missiles didn't stop. In Washington, D.C., the President of the United States walked onto a podium, cameras flashing. His tone was firm but careful. "The United States is deeply concerned by the escalating hostilities between India and Pakistan. We urge immediate de-escalation and offer to mediate if requested." But there was no offer of troops, no announcement of intervention. The U.S. had just withdrawn from a long war overseas. It wasn't ready for another. In Beijing, the Chinese government remained silent. China, a close ally of Pakistan and a wary neighbor of India, held no press conference. Its army, however, was placed on heightened alert along the Ladakh border. Satellite images showed convoys moving through Tibet. Something was being prepared, though no one knew exactly what. Russia took a different approach. President Mikhail Sorokin invited delegations from both countries to Moscow for emergency talks. Russian foreign ministry officials were seen meeting quietly with Indian and Pakistani ambassadors. Nothing was disclosed publicly, but everyone knew Russia was trying to prevent the worst. Meanwhile, Europe froze. France condemned the violence. Germany urged for peace. The United Kingdom evacuated staff from its embassies in both Delhi and Islamabad. Civilian flights were canceled. Airspace across South Asia was declared dangerous. Oil prices surged. The stock markets trembled. The world feared what came next, because when 2 nuclear-armed nations go to war, the world doesn't just watch, it holds its breath. Social media, however, didn't hold back. Platforms were flooded with panic, propaganda, and lies. On one side, Indian influencers posted emotional videos, images of soldiers, national flags, and burning wreckage set to dramatic music. On the other side, Pakistani content creators shared footage of evacuations, angry speeches, and prayers for victory. But somewhere in between were the deep fakes, fabricated videos showing fake bombings, fake leaders making declarations, even fake ceasefires that never happened. Hashtags trended every hour. Pray for Delhi. Stand with Kashmir. Stop the war. The internet became a battlefield of its own, where truth struggled to survive. In the chaos, foreign embassies shut their doors. Americans, Canadians, Australians, all urged their citizens to leave the region immediately. Roads to airports were jammed. Military escorts guarded evacuations. Some families left with only what they could carry. Others were trapped, unable to find a safe route. Humanitarian organizations issued warnings. If nuclear weapons are deployed, one UN analyst said, the death toll could be in the millions. Sanctions were discussed in European parliaments. Arms deals were suspended. Aid was redirected. But the machinery of diplomacy moved far too slowly to catch up with the speed of war. Back in Delhi, bunker construction surged. In Islamabad, lines formed at gas stations and grocery stores. Both countries braced for a long fight. The fear was no longer just about bombs or borders. It was about the unthinkable. At a NATO press briefing in Brussels, a single reporter asked the question everyone else was afraid to say out loud. If this escalates to nuclear war, what happens next? There was no answer, because even the most powerful nations in the world had no plan for what was unfolding. And as night fell again across South Asia, the skies lit up, not with fireworks or celebrations, but with the distant glow of airstrikes. The world was watching. The world was warning, but the war didn't care. Chapter 5. The Cyber Front. While missiles lit the sky and soldiers marched on fractured earth, another war raged in silence, a war fought in the shadows of cyberspace. It began with a flicker. At exactly 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, Mumbai's stock exchange servers went dark. No alarms, no explosions, just silence. Investors around the world watched as billions in data vanished from screens. Within minutes, similar blackouts hit Karachi's banking networks. Customers couldn't withdraw cash. Cards stopped working. Chaos moved from the skies into the digital veins of both nations. This wasn't a coincidence. It was the cyber front. Hackers, some working under military commands, others claiming allegiance to anonymous global groups, had begun an invisible siege. It was not limited to government systems. Hospitals, airports, traffic lights, even grocery supply chains, everything was now a target. In Delhi, a major power grid failed, plunging entire neighborhoods into darkness. Trains stalled on tracks. Emergency responders lost radio signals. Panic followed. In Lahore, a children's hospital lost access to its database. Doctors couldn't track patients. Life-saving machines froze mid-operation. In the hours it took to reboot the system, 3 children died. No bomb had fallen there, no gun had been fired, but the casualties were real. The cyber war escalated faster than any airstrike. Firewalls crumbled, encryption keys were stolen, ransomware attacks paralyzed entire cities. Social media platforms were overrun with fake alerts. evacuation orders that weren't real, threats of incoming attacks that never came. People didn't know what to believe anymore, and that was the point. Confusion became a weapon. India blamed a covert Pakistani cyber unit. Pakistan blamed Indian intelligence agencies. But somewhere between the digital skirmishes, a third shadow emerged. Outsiders. Anonymous accounts, neither Indian nor Pakistani, joined the assault. Some came from Eastern Europe. Others traced back to rogue entities in the Middle East. A few even operated from Western democracies, hidden behind 7 layers of proxies. They claimed no allegiance. Their only goal was destruction and disruption. "We fight for no flag," read a post from one such group, "but we will make your systems bleed." In Islamabad, airport radar systems glitched, causing several flights to turn back mid-air. In Bangalore, water treatment facilities failed for 6 hours, creating a temporary shortage across an entire district. These weren't just inconveniences. They were acts of war, modern and merciless. Meanwhile, citizens became soldiers. Teenagers with laptops launched denial-of-service attacks from their bedrooms. Discord servers turned into war rooms. Telegram channels shared tutorials on how to breach public servers. In a matter of days, thousands of amateur hackers across both countries joined the conflict, not for patriotism, but for pride, for power, or for vengeance. The line between military and civilian had completely disappeared. The internet was weaponized. Data became bullets. Code became bombs. India's Ministry of Electronics and Pakistan's Cyber Command issued statements promising retaliation and defense. But both sides were already compromised. Neither had expected this scale, this speed, this digital carnage. News anchors, already exhausted from covering the physical war, now tried to explain botnets and malware to terrified viewers. Emergency broadcasts warned citizens not to trust online messages unless verified. But by then, trust was already dead. One chilling event shocked the world. A missile warning system in northern India was triggered falsely. Civilians were told to evacuate. Sirens wailed. Chaos erupted. But there was no missile, just a spoofed signal. Who sent it? No one knows. The cyber front had no flags, no rules, no mercy. And as both nations bled across battlefields and servers, it became clear. This was no longer just a regional war. This was a new kind of war. A war where a keystroke could kill. Where a teenager could cause a blackout. Where peace could be shattered by code written in a dark room on the other side of the world. The age of tanks and trenches was not over, but the age of firewalls and viruses had begun. And in this war, no one, not soldier, not civilian, was safe. Chapter 6. The turning point weeks had passed since the skies first roared with warplanes and the earth trembled under marching tanks. The conflict was no longer a distant headline. It was a brutal reality etched into every scarred landscape and every shattered family. In the cold, rugged heights of Gilgit-Baltistan, a fierce battle raged. Indian forces pushed relentlessly, their sights set on a crucial supply route winding through the mountains. one that Pakistan relied on to fuel its front lines. The terrain was unforgiving, the stakes high. After days of grueling combat, India's troops finally seized control. This victory was more than a military gain. It was a message. Pakistan's response was swift and devastating. Missiles streaked across the sky, targeting power plants, railway junctions, and communication hubs deep inside India. Cities went dark. Panic spread. The war had reached a new, terrifying level, one where infrastructure itself became a battlefield. As news of the missile strikes flooded headlines, the world seemed poised on the edge of disaster. Then, unexpectedly, the war's tone shifted. In a quiet, discreet hotel suite in Dubai, far from the front line's chaos, a group of former diplomats and peace negotiators gathered. They were no longer the voices commanding armies or shaping national policy. Instead, they were unsung heroes, men and women who had once tried and failed to prevent this very war. Now, with the world watching and blood spilled on both sides, they worked in the shadows. Behind closed doors, heated conversations gave way to fragile agreements. Pride was set aside, if only temporarily. The cost of continued fighting was clear, not just in lives, but in the irreversible damage to both nations' futures. This chapter reveals the secret diplomacy unfolding out of the public eye, a fragile thread of hope woven through a storm of violence. A truce was drafted quietly, even as bombs continued to fall miles away. Soldiers in trenches heard the distant echoes of negotiation, uncertain whether peace was truly near or just another cruel illusion. Families clung to hope, leaders wrestled with pride, and the world held its breath. For in that silent room in Dubai, history hung in the balance between the devastation of war and the possibility of peace. Chapter 7. Peace or Pause. After 39 long, terrible days, the guns finally fell silent. The ceasefire was declared. The war was officially over, but the cost was staggering. Over 12,000 lives were lost. Entire villages vanished, wiped off the map by relentless bombardments. Families were shattered, mothers who lost sons, children who never saw their fathers again. The borderlands, once bustling with life and laughter, lay in ruins. Cities swelled with refugees fleeing the destruction. Makeshift aid camps struggled to keep up, their supplies stretched thin. Doctors and volunteers worked around the clock, patching wounds both seen and unseen. Yet, amid this suffering, politicians on both sides took to their podiums. They spoke of victory. They painted pictures of triumph. But was this really peace? For the people living near the border, the silence felt fragile. It was not the peace of celebration, but the uneasy quiet of a storm past, but not ended. The air still carried the sharp scent of gunpowder. Mothers whispered fears to their children, and soldiers stared at empty trenches, unsure if they would be called back. Some said the war had settled the dispute. Others believed it was just a pause, an uneasy breath before the next storm. Who truly gained? Who truly lost? The answer was not simple. The landscape was scarred, but so were the hearts of millions. And the question lingered. Would this ceasefire hold, or was the shadow of war still waiting, just beyond the horizon? Chapter 8. Lessons from the Ashes. The war was over, but its marks remained everywhere. The land was broken. The cities were bruised. But even more deeply, the hearts of people were changed. Neighbors who once smiled now looked at each other with suspicion. Old friendships were tested. The meaning of patriotism, sacrifice, and survival was no longer just words. It was lived pain and memory. How did it all begin? Could it have been stopped? These questions echoed in the minds of many. The story started with small sparks, words, actions, misunderstandings that grew like wildfire. The conflict was more than just borders and politics. It was about fear, pride, and history tangled in a cycle that seemed never-ending. Through the stories of soldiers, families, and strangers touched by the war, we see the true cost. A mother who lost her son at the front. A young soldier who dreamed of peace but found only battle. An old man who watched his village disappear beneath smoke and fire. We return to the quiet cemetery from where the story began. The grave of the young soldier, laid to rest on that sunny day in April, reminds us of the price paid. The silence there is heavy, not empty, but filled with memories and warnings. The final words are a call for peace and understanding, for the next time when tensions rise, for people to choose dialogue over destruction, because the next war may not leave anyone behind to tell the story. We must learn from the ashes. We must build bridges, not walls. And remember, peace is not just the absence of war, but the presence of hope.